We've been looking at the various RComp products. Now we're going to talk about RISC developments. The second half of the talk is listed here, so if you wanted to sort of see some of the topics that we're going to be talking about, you can do so by looking at the crib sheet. RISC Developments was formed, I think, 2017, 2017, something like that, primarily to tackle big projects within the RISC market, and nothing comes bigger than the web browser, which was our headline initial product. The web browser is now generally available in beta on Pling Store as a chargeable item. If you buy O Browser, it gives you access to Iris Beta. That's not us charging intentionally for Iris, but it's to provide a mechanism for people to be able to donate towards the work that is being done, because developing a browser is not cheap. We do pay our programmers, and so we do need some sort of donations and funds in. It will ultimately be free of charge to everybody, so we are not trying to sort of put it behind a paywall permanently, but whilst it's in beta test, we felt that it was a way to help get some funds in for RISC developments. The Iris web browser we have here. This is a build that was sent to me this month by the programmer. It's not wildly different to the version that you can download either as a shareholder or as a tester with the O browser thing. The main changes are in the hot list. If we look at the bookmarks, this looks a little bit different to what you've seen before. We've got some buttons down the side. We'll come to talk about this in a minute. First, we'll look at Iris itself. We're running on the Forte 2, so that's basically Pi 4 type level performance. This is basically what you'll see with Iris if you're running on a decent Pi 4 setup. Pi 400 titanium type setup. It will be slightly slower if you're running on older systems. But as we were doing, we did a demonstration comparing them during the Q&A before the talk, and you know it was pretty usable regardless of what we tried it on. But there were performance gains here and there. I am running from RAM disk today because that does give another slight boost to performance, particularly in font handling. If I go to something like Wikipedia, it tends to come up noticeably more quickly if I'm running from RAM disk, because Wikipedia uses, if we scroll down and have a little look down the left hand side, you'll see the funny fonts and typefaces for overseas languages. So I shouldn't call them funny, but you know what I mean. It's non-Latin 1 fonts from down the left hand side. Those are being pulled from a range of typefaces that come with the browser, and there's a certain amount of time that is spent reading all the font caches and writing all the font caches, which is alleviated if I'm running from RAM. So that's why I'm running from RAM. But you can see that the experience is pretty solid. We are coming now over multiple network connections and the internet, so apologies if scrolling and things are not slickly smooth in this environment. But you can see that you know, that's pretty good. Let's go back to that page, bring up a couple of other sites. I always have a soft spot for the icon bar. You can see coming up very fast and smooth. Again, in the pre-talk, we actually did some comparisons with NetSurf on the icon bar. Whilst NetSurf is very fast and probably still has the edge, scroll that up and use it. You can see moving around in NetSurf versus if we go to a website, scroll up, drag and drop issue. Not wildly different using Iris. So although Iris does get bagged on for speed, honestly, on the right hardware setup, it's not horrible. You know, it's not going to chase down your i5, you know, latest Intel i5, i7 type systems. Of course not, because, you know, the ARM processors are clocked much slower and are simpler architectures. But I think, in terms of giving people a modern web browser on RISC-OS, IRIS is hitting a lot of boxes. We can go see, predicts what you're typing just like a modern web browser would. It's the same experience that you would expect from a modern web browser. Comparing it to Chromium, not a wild amount of difference in terms of performance. And at times, IRIS actually feels faster. But that's probably more because RISC-OS itself feels snappier. But you see, we're getting a pretty positive experience. In the latest build, as I said, we've revamped the bookmarks. We now have a folder system, so we can add folders to the bookmarks. We can drag and drop the bookmarks in and out in standard Acorn or ANT bookmark formats. You can drag bookmarks in to IRIS in the standard formats. They will load into whichever folder you've got selected. It's basically a more flexible bookmark system in the latest build of IRIS. There's still work to be done. There's still ways we can make it tidier and slightly, I think, even more RISC-OS-like. But you can see that what we're trying to do with IRIS is deliver the engine of a modern web browser in the experience of a RISC-OS application. Obviously, we have things like tab browsing. We can hover over a tab and we can just close it. You can choose whether you get a blank page or your home page when you close the last tab in a window. We can click on links in Messenger or something and have them open in IRIS. It's, a solid bit of browser. This whole presentation on the Forte is actually running on the next thing to talk about, which is the TCP/IP stack. TCP/IP is available for download from the RISC-OS Developments website right now. It's free, it's open source. You can download. Can you download the source code? You can request the source code, I think, and we send it via email. But basically, the source code has been sent out to all manner of people to have a play with, and the TCP/IP stack itself is available for free download. It adds IPv4, IPv6 support to modern RISC-OS 5 systems, and basically brings RISC-OS networking up to date with modern TCP/IP. It can give huge speed benefits. Some of the network drivers have been reported to be up to 40 times faster, although in practice it tends to be a plus minus 20% type experience. It really does depend what you're doing. As I say, everything you're seeing here today is coming over the new stack because I'm VNCing over the network directly into the Forte. So basically everything that's happening is happening over the new TCP/IP stack. And compatibility with existing applications is pretty much 100%. I'm always loath to say something 100% because somebody's always going to find something, but honestly, we haven't had any reports of incompatibilities. That's probably going to jinx it, but you get the idea. We support back to Acorn's Internet 4 specification, Internet 5 specification, which is more common these days. So basically, essentially all RISC-OS Internet application specifications are supported by the new stack, as well as the more modern capabilities. The stack lays the way for Wi-Fi, and there is in fact an 802.11 component compiled into the stack already. 802.11, for those who are unfamiliar, are the standards that govern Wi-Fi. Covers things like the encryption, negotiations. Basically, it's the stack level of Wi-Fi. So basically, you have the stack's understanding of Wi-Fi. At the top, you tend to have a front end where you pick which Wi-Fi network you connect to. Below that, you have the stack's understanding of Wi-Fi. Then that connects to the network driver, which is a hardware-specific piece of technology that actually determines, sort of links the stack to the actual hardware network Wi-Fi that you're using. And obviously, that then connects via the Wi-Fi to your router. The next release, which is imminent we just need to go through final beta, for the stack is basically not Wi-Fi, unfortunately. I know a lot of people would like it to be. The next bit that we're going to release very shortly is basically compatibility with pretty much everything else that isn't already compatible. So essentially that means sort of third-party drivers like the LSR Wi-Fi hat now work without modification. We basically put a layer in to the stack that understands old network drivers and can translate between the new stack and old network drivers. There might be a small performance hit doing that because they're not sort of taking advantage of the new stack stuff natively, but it wasn't noticeable, and certainly on something like the Wi-Fi hat where you're already sort of dropping performance because of how it's connected, there's going to be no real difference between using the compatibility layer and having a native driver, and that means by extension that things, all the previous generations of network driver will also work with the new stack. At the same time, we're doing versions of the stack that support older CPUs. So theoretically, you can go back to a RISC PC. You can certainly run it on RPCMU now, for example, just using RPCMU stock network driver, which we felt was important for developers wishing to take advantage of the stack and develop new IPv6 software, having the ability to run it on basically any generation of RPCMU through Ionix, through BeagleBoard, Panda, basically anything RISC-OS5 capable can run the new stack now. So basically that work is done, pending testing on all the different permutations and combinations of stuff available, and that's the next thing is get that tested, then get it out. That should be happening this summer, and then Wi-Fi full speed. To be honest with you, the Wi-Fi work is actually continuing on in parallel with the beta testing, because programmers are just eager to get on with stuff. The way we're going to tackle the Wi-Fi is to start by using an off-the-shelf Wi-Fi adapter that has drivers already for the stack. So essentially what we've, as warm-up for getting the stack ready, what we've for going to Wi-Fi, what we did was to do some tests porting some additional network drivers from the OpenBSD base code and connecting them to RISC-OS to find the process that's required to convert a network driver from BSD to running natively on RISC-OS. And that's essentially a learning process for the programmers. They chose a USB attached, I think it was a Realtek USB chip as a test bed, because that's not natively supported by RISC-OS normally. The USB Ethernet driver for RISC-OS doesn't do Realtek chips, so we use that as a sort of as a test bed, and then the next step is to test with a supported USB Wi-Fi adapter, because essentially the same processes should apply. That if we've converted a USB wired adapter, then converting a USB wireless adapter should be, from a network perspective, network driver perspective, the same process, but then it'll show us which bits we need to expose, what calls and things we need to be exposing into the stack to allow a Wi-Fi driver to work, as opposed to a wired driver. And once we've got that up and running, we're taking a known good network driver, adapting that for RISC-OS to give us a known good RISC-OS driver, and then we can look at more esoteric devices. I say esoteric, that's not quite the right word, but something like sort of SDIO based drivers like Pi and what have you. The SDIO work has been done as part of some work we paid for earlier in the year. That's still going through the rule infrastructure system, so hopefully that will then be available by the time we're ready to get to that, and then we can sort of plug into that for the SDIO based network drivers once we prove the system with the existing drivers that we are familiar with from the BSD code that we have. So hopefully that sounds like a sensible plan. That's the way we're working. and gives you an idea of our roadmap towards Wi-Fi. Pinboard 2. You can see that I have sticky notes down the right-hand side guiding me. Pinboard 2 is available just by dropping an email to RISC Developments or to me saying, can I have a copy? It's free, and we'll send you the latest beta. This one is running on a beta from a couple of weeks ago. I was showing off some of the new stuff pre-stream. I'm not going to show all of the new stuff in this talk because some of it I did encounter a couple of bugs last night when I was doing tests. So some of the stuff that we haven't really announced still has bugs. Shock horror. So I'll just show you the stuff we have announced, as it were, which is working just fine. Basically, Pinboard 2. You can save work to the pinboard. We can sort of go blah, 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 save. And perennially on RISC, you're working on a document, you can't see where to save it, so you just want to save somewhere, but you haven't got your file window open. You just dump it onto the desktop. You'll see that doesn't have a pin icon on it, so we know that that's an actual file. You can choose where the files get iconized to and things. This tidied up and improved on the iconization system. Somebody in Holland was complaining about Acorn's iconization tidying and made some suggestions that were very sensible, so we've implemented those. The pinboard itself acts like a filer window, so if you look at the section below the dotted line, these are all the things you would expect from an ordinary filer window. Above the line we have things that are pinboard specific, like locking the position on the pinboard, alignment to grid. We can set an alias for an item so that, for example, if we don't want, I mean, it's probably not a good example, but you know, if you wanted to change something like, oh, I've lost connection to, so the sidekick's gone to sleep, so we lost our VNC connection to it. If we wanted to change NetSurf to be web browser, for example, we could set an alias for NetSurf to be, and now you can see it comes up as web browser on the pinboard rather than !NetSurf. We can have watermarks that are vector graphics. So this Forte 2 logo at the top is a vector graphics file that's being overlaid onto the desktop, which is pretty cool. You can combine both bitmap wallpapers and vector elements, or do flat color with vectors. So I've seen people using maps of their hometown made with RISC OSM as a backdrop over the top of plain color background that they set as the base thing. We can set sticky notes. We can make a new sticky. Latest version has made it much more flexible in terms of resizing stickies, even after we've made them. Notes in. We can set title. We can change the font. I don't know. We can set a title. It shows up in the title bar when we hover over it, but normally it just looks like a sticky note. We can drag that around, stick it down here. All right. Like most things with the pinboard, it will save automatically, but we can save manually if we wish. That's another thing, that you can optionally have it automatically save your pinboard at shutdown rather than having to manually save, which has to do with the current pinboard. Essentially, the idea is to make the pinboard as good as we can possibly make it. This handles multiple formats of image. It will cache the converted images for speed. It's just a load of good stuff, revamping the desktop to be something that's more modern, while still trying to respect all of the functionality that work the same way. So if you're just used to using your pinboard the old way, you can still use it the old way, and it'll work great. But it's just that, you know, there are various little improvements that will allow it to work better and more smoothly. It's hard to, even if you're not taking advantage of all the stickies. Just for example, if you use a JPEG as your backdrop, for example, it will cache the converted JPEG rather than trying to recalculate the JPEG as you move your window over it, making redraw slow. And just stuff like that is just really a nice improvement that I wouldn't want to live without, even if I wasn't making use of all the extra stuff. So Pinboard 2, it's pretty cool. Available for free if you just ask for a copy. Technically it's beta, which is why it's asked for a copy, but we are getting very close to general release. It's just that we keep thinking of cool things to add, which we should probably stop doing that, but it is fun adding cool stuff to Pinboard. As you can probably tell, Pinboard is something of a pet project. It was actually something that I want, you know, I offered initially put it out to programmers as just me, but it made more sense the more we thought about it to make it a RISC dev project. So it's been taken under its wing by RISC dev rather than our comp or Andrew, as it were. RISC OS Direct, you probably know about RISC OS Direct by now. It's an outreach project, videos, SD cards to new users. It's a version of RISC-OS 5 for Pi or RISC-OS RPCMU that's ready to go with a whole heap of licensed software. In our view, it's an aim to give people the experience of RISC-OS we would want if we were getting started with RISC-OS, either as a new user or a returning user or somebody who's already familiar with RISC-OS. It's that bit more than, you know, if you grab a rule bundle, that's fine. You've got all the core parts for the Acorn, all the core Acorn parts. Rule tend to keep their main distributions sensibly limited to what Acorn tended to put out, which is great. But there's so much good stuff out there that goes beyond what Acorn did. RISC-OS Direct is an attempt to basically collate that together for users so that somebody fresh to the platform can get a better experience of the breadth of RISC-OS software that's out there, rather than just sort of seeing the Acorn apps that you would get normally with a free distribution of RISC-OS, because so much of the cool RISC-OS stuff that we all use on a daily basis comes from the third-party community that users wouldn't know existed if they weren't familiar with the community involved. So it's essentially a way to broaden RISC-OS's user base, to give people a positive experience of RISC-OS, and we're hoping to have an update released for RISC-OS Direct sometime over the summer or into the autumn, time permitting. Looking at the clock, PRM in XML is the next thing. This is something where we're working with Jeff, as many know him, Charles, formerly of RISC-OS Limited. Basically, Jeff had the idea of standardizing documentation for programmers on RISC-OS using XML as a middleman, essentially. For those unfamiliar with XML, it's a bit like HTML, but more general purpose. And it can be edited in a text editor like StrongEd. And you basically apply what we call a schema to XML to turn it into something else that would be readable in, say, like PDF or HTML or print or whatever. You takes the HTML code, it takes the XML and processes it into something else. The beauty of XML is that it's standardized and multi-platform. The tools to work with it are available for RISC-OS as well as other platforms, and we can get out of the XML HTML, we can get out of the PDF, we can get a printed version if you like. So if I go to the ROD folder, we can have a look at, I've got a little video showing the output. Where are we? Oh no, I didn't test this bit of the talk. Help, help. It's not where I was expecting it to be. Panic. I will just connect to my NAS. And go to the developments and PRM and XML, and see if we have demo. Impact. Okay, so that's 1080p1. I'll just do the 720p to save the bandwidth on the machine. Just bear with me. Let's pop that onto there. I'll talk about it while it's copying. For some reason the NAS is slow to respond, so I don't know. Basically, PRM in XML produces they've covered about 2/3 of the PRM, as well as Charles. There's also Alan Robertson is doing a lot of the work in processing the PRM information, and it also covers all sorts of different documentation from various sources. So the idea is that the documentation produced with PRM and XML can be used. Doesn't have to be just limited to PRM. It can be all sorts of documentation. Being XML based, it's essentially plain text, so it can be incorporated into a GitLab tree like the rule one. So documentation stored this way can be stored alongside source code, which makes for maintainability. If the code is, if you've got the source code and you've got the documentation next to each other, then it's very straightforward for a programmer to update both in line with each other, whereas previously PRM information has been locked in proprietary formats and not really been maintainable. So if I run the demo video, hopefully you can see this sensibly over the internet link. Apologies if you can't. It's essentially a PDF version. There's two fun things. Firstly, I wanted to use a video because people think RISC-OS can't really do video. So here's RISC-OS doing a video, standard MP4 that Charles created on a Mac, being played back quite happily on RISC-OS. You can see, if you're familiar with the PRMs, the output from PRM and XML looking very, very similar to what you would expect in an ordinary copy of the PRMs. You can see at the top that there are 3,500 pages of documentation here, all bracketed into the sections. The documentation is cross-referenceable, so you can click on things, and as I say, can be output in HTML or PDF. There's an index contents down the left-hand side. It's what you would expect for documentation in 2022, but stemming from a single maintainable source, which is the XML. We think this is a very worthwhile project and are supporting it as much as we can. We feel that this is a way of making sure that next generation of programmers has got access to the information they need to be able to develop software on RISC-OS. And this is the key, is that RISC-OS needs more software. You don't have more software if you don't have the information out there on how to write that software. So RISC-OS Developments is keen to support tools like Python, GCC, etc. Iris is delivered as GCC 10. We've supported development of Python 3. We've got the documentation here being developed. Again, it's building the user base. It's building a future where we've got more people developing RISC-OS with modern tools. So yeah. Applications, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We're just about fitting in time. Applications is just a side bit to talk about things like Landman 98, impression, available for free with source, etc. from RISC-OS Developments. If you go to Plingstar, you'll find those programs. We've got more programs scheduled for the future. Can't really talk too much about them. But RISC-OS Development's keen to preserve existing applications, make them available, release source code where possible, incorporate updates, make sure everything works as best we can on modern machines. If it's going to need aiming, and make sure that that's handled in a seamless and compatible manner, like impression. Obviously, if we can update and recompile things like Landman 98, then make sure we've got the latest builds, improve them where we can, and get them out to people with the source code. So we want to curate a few, applications. If people have left the platform and are sort of happening, across this video, we'd obviously welcome your software that, in terms of curating for people who've left the platform, want the software to be preserved. Please get in touch. We're keen to make that available free of charge to people to keep it going. And the final section before we go to Q&A is the grand plan. It's not as grand as you might think, because I've been referring to it indirectly through the entirety of the talk of RISC-OS developments. But I think it's possibly just worth joining all the dots together, because some people struggle to see RISC-OS developments as a whole, and what we're doing and where we're going. Essentially, RISC-OS developments is the solution, or is our solution anyway, to the future of the RISC-OS platform. Sounds a bit grand, but there we go. RISC-OS has big challenges ahead. We've talked about the web browser and how much of a grand project that is, but you can see that bearing fruit. Without a web browser, RISC-OS has very little relevance to a modern computer enthusiast. With Iris in play, it can compete on a level playing field with other platforms. You can see, compared to Raspbian, you're getting a similar level of performance in Iris. Sorry, I should call it Raspberry Pi OS, not Raspbian. Apologies. We're getting a similar level of browser performance, similar access to websites. So we've leveled the playing field there. We've implemented a new TCP/IP stack to improve the networking side of the computer. We're working towards Wi-Fi. Need the TCP/IP stack to deliver Wi-Fi. Getting Wi-Fi is another big hurdle to stopping people. People expect Wi-Fi on a modern system. RISC-OS doesn't offer the Wi-Fi. That's an impediment to a new user taking RISC-OS on board. You need development tools. You need development documentation, because without that, you won't get new software. Existing users want new software as much as new users do, but you're not going to get those new people unless they've got the programming tools they expect and the documentation for the operating system that they would expect available for free. You're also not going to get them if they don't have access to the operating system itself in a form that is as feature-packed as possible. So you've got RISC-OS Direct on the most commonly available RISC-OS platform, the Raspberry Pi. We've got a whole stack of SD cards that we bought to just give away for free to people who are interested in RISC-OS, to make the zero barrier for entry to RISC-OS for new users. For existing users, RISC-OS Direct provides a great sort of one-stop, put it in your Raspberry Pi and get going with all your favorite RISC-OS apps. It's an operating system curated by our partners at RISC-OS Open, using common RISC-OS ROM between all whether you're running RISC-OS Direct, whether you're running real versions of the operating system, they're all running the same RISC-OS ROM. So people have said we're fragmenting the operating system. No, RISC-OS developments is making RISC-OS accessible and available widely using the exact same operating system base that our partners at Rule are doing. We talk to Rule, we have meetings, we share software, we share source code with them. They've got the full source code to the TCP/IP stack. It's companies working together to deliver a common future. We're looking at 64-bit problem. I was talking briefly about that in the pre-stream Q&A. We can talk more about that in post-stream. We have developers working on different techniques for tackling 64-bit, because ultimately that's going to be a big challenge in the future. RISC-OS developments is putting the sort of, the joke is I've got 2 day jobs essentially. RComp's my day job that I get paid for. RISC-OS developments is me donating my time to the RISC-OS platform. It's another day job. I don't know when I sleep, sketchily I think, but basically it's people putting in time to make to make RISC-OS better, to tackle the big problems of RISC-OS. And big shout out to all our programmers: Lee, Michael, Jeffrey, Jeff, Alan. I think I did an article for I think it was published in Archive. Had a big long list of people's names who would say thank you for. It's a community working together to tackle the big problems and move RISC-OS forwards and deliver an operating system that can rival the likes of Raspberry Pi OS as a platform for Pi and ARM devices going forwards. That's what RISC-OS development is about, and that's what we're trying to deliver to you, all as much as possible on a free to access basis. So an open source. Whew. I hope I haven't bored you all to death. And with that, I will ask, does anybody have any questions? I'm just going to stop sharing that screen.
So you mentioned that Rod is now doing what I've been doing for a while, so collecting old sources to be maintained and propose it to other people. So my questions are, how you guys are planning to share those sources, first of all? What are the plans for the maintenance costs? Because the way I'm doing this is completely free, and whoever wants to help, just join and fix the bugs or changes something. So how you guys are planning to because it's a lot of stuff actually around. There's a lot of stuff.
Okay, so I mean, at the moment we're only just dealing with a handful of applications, but as that grows, I believe we've actually had conversations with you behind the scenes about sort of your thoughts on GitLab and GitHub and what have you. And so basically, I think there seems to be there's obviously politics in GitHub versus GitLab, but I can certainly see the logic in the public profile of GitHub. And I think there's a sort of tendency to sort of follow your lead there in terms of GitHub being a good place to host things long term. Essentially, there's conversations to be had in that area, basically, and it's if I'm sounding vague, it's more because Richard and I have an awful lot of stuff on our shoulders, and some of this is stuff that I hope that we can not offload, but share with community members who have experience of maintaining these kind of programs in source repositories on Git platforms. It's not necessarily my primary skill set, so I don't see why I should be trying to sort of dictate what the terms are. I think I would rather work with partners like yourself and others who have experience of Git and maintaining projects, but under a RISC-OS developments umbrella, because obviously as platform IPR holders, we can present that in a way that is sort of joined up to people around the world. And I didn't mention that, but one of the things that we've seen since we open sourced the operating system and did all the various things that we've done is a much larger uptake of RISC-OS around the world in places that I don't associate with RISC-OS. Much more interest in the USA, Canada. We've seen interest in the Far East. We've seen interest in South America. Obviously this course is being taught in Spain. I think it's Spain anyway.
There is one thing one of the things that is important to pinpoint is that a lot of the sources that I obtained from the original developers has not been published yet, not because it's 26 bits or VS32, but it's because as a lot of things that were actually present only on their original machine, for which they no longer have the machine. So I'm actually reconstructing the bits required to compile the code or to let it run. Can
I briefly stop you there, Paolo? Sure. Not wishing to be rude. No. I'd like to talk at great length about this, but it's just if anybody had any specific RComp questions that they wanted to do before they go over to rules. Was there anything anybody urgently needed to talk to me about before they jump out of the session? Sorry, you were saying.
No, yeah. So the biggest problem is actually making those sources compilable again, assemblable again. So which is why I haven't published a lot of this stuff, because it really some of it's missing bytes, like big portions of things used in the past to compile them, which is the biggest problem. Which is why I was asking if you guys have any secret source, because it's a major slowdown. It's even then obviously the moment we release the source public, there must be an associated license with it. And the original author has to agree with that, so you have to explain the license to them, all the options they have.
Agreed.
Yeah, so it's a lot. There is a lot of.
Generally speaking, we try to get the author to give us a sort of carte blanche where possible, and so that we can choose the license that we go with. We've been using CDDL for the licensing because basically that. My feeling is that whenever you do a open source project, you're striking a balance. You effectively want to ensure that source gets fed back to the master repository, because you don't want the product to be branched horrifically out away from, into multiple different versions. But you want a certain level of protection, but you also want a certain level of openness, and trying to find that balance. The CDDL license gives a certain level of flexibility, but does require code to be fed back where possible, or at least made available where possible, so you don't have people taking something that's open source, branching it, making it closed source.
That's great, but it was, again, the problem in that specific case is to explain it to the original author, because he has or she has to agree on the license.
Exactly. So that's why we've tended to try and push for relatively for carte blanche, and just sort of say, trust us, we'll do right by you. Depends on the person and how flexible they are. I agree with you. So far we've been lucky, that's all I'll say. People have tended to, but if you've got somebody who's more protective, absolutely, then talking through licensing is key. One thing I would say is it's well worth sharing those things, that a problem shared is often this goes down in hackneyed. Problem shared is a problem halved, especially if you've got limited time available. That there may be things where we can help out or find other people to help out alongside what you're doing personally, and obviously still credit. One thing RISC Developmentsat is very much about is ensuring people receive credit for work. So you'll see if you look in the IRIS info box, for example, it's got Lee's name in the info box, not RISC Developments. We don't want people to miss out on credit. If you've got things that are tucked away, do share, and we can see what we can do in terms of helping get things compiled. For example, I tend to have quite an archaic development environment myself, which has actually helped out getting a few of the older programs recompiled and updated, because there aren't so many people who program in RISC-lib these days, for example. A lot of old software was written in RISC-lib, so I have a familiarity there, where RISC-lib has changed quite dramatically over the years. So old RISC-lib code does not necessarily straight compile with a rule era RISC-lib, for example.
We do have I do have an actual very good library of tutorials, which were all the original Acorn tutorial that they published on the various, DU CDs and the clan and everything else, which I started to patch and all this jazz. But nobody seems to have the rights for those. So I'm not sure how we can release them, because they would be extremely helpful instead of just releasing full complex application, which is also helpful in other cases, but people have to start from something. And I think I already contacted you guys about this, by the way. So for the licensing of, in theory we could, because Acorn themselves released the sources back then for us to learn, right? Mm-hmm. So in theory there should be no problem. I'm making no money out of it, so it's no cost.
Exactly.
So maybe that. Anyway, thank you very much, and nice presentation, and definitely a Messenger AirComp stuff. Now, the Messenger Pro 9 is worth the update. I will contact you as soon as possible for that, because the encryption is very useful. Thank you very much.
I just realised I didn't talk about fireworks today. So, oh well. I always forget something. So much to talk about.
It's good to have a lot, right?
I guess so.
Oh, anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Paolo.